G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope you are super well. In today's speculation video by popular demand, yes, people have been asking me in the comments to speculate on what will be the Z9, the Z5 and the Z7 replacements. And in this video, we won't just get one version of speculation. There could be two, maybe even three, depending on which camera we're talking about. And my thoughts, for example, around the Z9 have changed a little since Sony launched the A7II. So we'll talk about the Z9 last, so that's down the other end of the video. But before we jump into the Z5, I just wanted to touch on the notion of the Z9. Some discussion that the Z9, is it or is it not a flagship? How can that even be a discussion? It quacks like a flagship. It looks like a flagship. It feels like a flagship. And it has the price tag of a flagship. It is a flagship. We are in a brand new line of cameras from F, the old days, F1 through to F5, D, D1 through to D6. Now we're in Z. This is a new paradigm. So when it comes to naming, Nikon can do what they want. When it comes to what this is, it's very clear. There is no ambiguity. Alrighty, let's talk about the Z5. Now, the Z6 here is representing the Z5 because I don't own a Z5. We have my Z7 and my Z9s all here. Now, the Z5 was launched in July of 2020, and that is now 4.5 years ago. Of these camera lines, this is now the oldest of the cameras sitting here today. Of course, we're talking about the Z7II, not the original Z7. I don't own the Z7II. Simply from a chronological perspective, it is next in line for a little bit of an update, a little bit of a tweak here and there. Now, when it comes to the competition in the market, there's not really a great deal that is current. There are more modern offerings that have faster processors but don't have in-body image stabilization. Those faster processors do allow for faster frame rates and better video codecs, but often the sort of people buying a Z5, they don't need more than 5 frames per second, and they don't need more than the 4K, the cropped 4K that the Z5 offers. It is 4.5 years old and it's time for an update. Obviously, XPEED 7 is where Nikon's range is up to now, and Nikon are slowly transitioning all their cameras over to XPEED 7. We know now that it will be all because the Z5II has also had the XPEED 7 upgrade, and it would be considered, if not their most entry level, very close to entry level. The Z5 is certainly above it. So to start off with, a Z5II would most certainly be XPEED 7, and it would come with all of the advancements that XPEED 7 gives us, which is 10-bit video, which is subject detection modes and fantastic autofocus. We've seen all of this appearing in the Z5II. Also, as this is a more modern camera, I would expect Nikon's imaging cloud to also be part of that offering. Basically, any camera that's going from XPEED 6 to XPEED 7 is always going to be a massive jump. Just to reiterate what already a lot of us know, that an XPEED 7 that came in the Z9 here was 10 times faster than the two XPEED 6s which were in the Z6II and the Z7II. It's a massive jump. Whether we will ever see a jump like this in processing power again, I don't know. I think Nikon clearly made some major strides going from XPEED 6 to XPEED 7 when it comes to CPUs, and the XPEED 7 is already extraordinarily powerful and does so much. And thus, Z5II will look a lot like a Z50II, but of course it will be a full-frame sensor. It will have in-body image stabilization. It will have 2 card slots like the Z5 currently does. And of course, it will run a lot faster. Now, I don't expect it to have a sensor like the Z6III, that is a semi-stacked sensor that runs at 20 frames per second in electronic shutter and minimizes rolling shutter very, very well. Sensor-wise, perhaps we'll see a sensor somewhere between a Z6II sensor and a ZF sensor. And I think that will be a really great place to be. To surmise, a Z5II will be similar to a Z50II when it comes to XP7 and all that it offers, plus IBIS, plus full frame, plus 2 card slots. Anything else? Please do let me know in the comments below. All right, let's talk about the Z7III. Will it ever happen? It's a really tough one from my perspective. We've been talking about it for a number of years now. The first speculation was starting to happen in the 2-year mark after the Z7II came out, because of course the gap between the Z7 and the Z7II was 2 years, and some of us thought it might be another 2 years for the Z7III. Never happened. It took 4 years to go from Z6II to Z6III. Z7III, if it comes out next year, if it exists, it will be a 5-year gap. Now, it's easy to see why Nikon is not rushing to make this camera. They have now 4 45.7 megapixel cameras in their range. Not that the Z7 is new anymore, but there's the Z7, the Z7II, the Z8, and the Z9. They are all 45.7 megapixels. And as we saw in my recent comparison for the A7R5 and the Z8, there's really not much of a meaningful difference between 60 megapixels and 45.7 megapixels. Ultimately, what it ends up being is there's around about 600 pixels either side of your frame on the long edge. Okay. It's more. But in real terms, for the majority of users, is that necessary? Well, that's up to individual use case, and obviously Sony A7R5s and Sony A7CRs are being sold because of that resolution. Conversely, Sony don't actually have a camera in this market. The closest megapixel-wise is the A1 or the A1II, and that is a flagship camera with a flagship price, which is now $10,999 in this country, where a Z7 in this country is anywhere between the very high threes when it's on discount and around $4,500 street price. Now, what we're talking about here is specifically megapixels, not all of the other bells and whistles that comes with a Z7II versus an A1. Clearly, the A1 is far superior on many other fronts. But when it comes to megapixels, and the sort of person who is buying a Z7II in the past hasn't bought it for bird in flight or action. They have bought it for portraiture, landscape, architecture, still life, weddings. The list goes on and on. You can shoot wildlife. You're just not going to get those blindingly fast automatic subject detection modes that do everything for you that you find in a Z9, a Z8, an A1, an R1, an R5II, and so on. A Z7 and a Z7II, if you do those slower types of photography, portraiture, landscape, architecture, so on, still life, etc. Amazing. Amazing image quality for that sensor. It's one of the best sensors, the Z7 and the Z7II, along with the D850. I think they're all related, that Nikon have ever made when it comes to overall image quality. It's a tough question. Do you go higher megapixels and start to cause diffraction to be visible sooner? Do you potentially impact dynamic range, ISO, and other factors as you push out beyond 60 megapixels? It's hard to say. From my perspective, 60 megapixels is kind of not worth doing. Sony do it because they don't have a camera in that space. You either get the A7 IV at 33 megapixels, or you get the A1 at 50 megapixels. There's nothing in between. There's nothing at that price point. And thus they just simply, instead of going 45 to 50 like Nikon and Canon, they went, we'll go the other way. We'll go to 60. Probably the most obvious downside to that sensor is rolling shutter. You just can't really use it for anything that's moving faster than a person riding on a bike for video. And if you want to shoot silently and anything is moving faster than a person riding on a bike, like 20 kilometers an hour, which is like 14 miles per hour, you will see rolling shutter. Otherwise, yes, it's a very good, very competent sensor. If I was Nikon and I was putting out a Z7 III, I suppose I'd want to differentiate as well. And because their cameras, they have so many cameras at the 45 megapixel mark, and there really isn't that big a difference between 45 and 60, I feel like the megapixels need to be higher. But then I wonder if the trade-offs that occur are not worth it because Nikon is interested in such high quality outcomes. So this leaves me a little bit vexed as to what a Z7 III might be. I don't think it's going to be another 45 megapixels. It might be 60 megapixels because those sensors are still great. We know for a fact how good the A7CR and the A7R5 are. Great. The A7R5 first came out, I think, 3 years ago. So if Nikon were to release something, say, next year, it's very possible that we would have a 60 megapixel sensor that is faster, has a better readout speed. And thus, well, that might be enough of a compromise for the Z7 III. Yes, more megapixels, not very much more. Faster readout speed so it can still do video and can still work with the XP7 and get all the advantages of that. Or, and I don't think this is very likely, but heading to 80 or 100 megapixels. Essentially what we see in a XT5 or an XH2 is an APS-C sensor which is 40 megapixels. Now this is around the same pixel density as a 100 megapixel 35mm sensor. Now you hear a lot of good things about those cameras, but I also hear people being frustrated with diffraction and also how good is it at higher ISOs. So there is a downside to putting such small photo sites on a 35mm sensor. So where does the Z7 III fit? My best guess is it's probably somewhere in the middle of what I said. It might be 60, 70, 80 megapixels, and hopefully it's got a more modern sensor than the one we see in the A7R5 or the A7CR. Now, interestingly, just as I was preparing to record this video, I saw a rumor on Sony Alpha Rumors suggesting that the A7R6 might be 100 megapixels. Interesting. Now that throws another cat amongst the pigeons. If Sony think they've got it, it's probably going to be a good sensor. It might have rolling shutter issues. Who knows? Because that is a lot of data. The camera will not be a flagship. They won't want to throw everything at it. And if Sony go to that space and other manufacturers, Nikon, come out with something that's less than that, then it doesn't really make a splash in the market. Somewhere between 60 and 100 megapixels if it ever exists, because I do see a world where maybe it won't. We have to keep in mind that there are a lot of mirrorless cameras in the market today. There's a lot of competition and a camera has to be worth making. You have to get your return on your investment. For example, the A9III, a hugely technologically advanced camera. Absolutely. No question. Global shutter. It's a big deal. But it has ended up, as we predicted, being a niche camera. Absolutely. Without a shadow of a doubt. Now, because of that niche, has it sold enough units? And the answer might be, no, it has not. And then from Sony's perspective, it might be technologically successful, but it might be financially a fail. So all camera companies have to think about this. They can make a camera, they can make it great, they can make it look good, they can make it a technological leader and make it look like, yeah, they are leading the pack. But if a product actually fails to break even, does that actually mean it's a failed product? And that is a very interesting corporate question. And I'd love to know, because the anecdotal evidence that I've heard from a few of my colleagues around the industry is the A9III does not sell that much. Interesting, isn't it? And that does inform us that, well, camera companies are going to be shy about making products that they simply can't sell enough of. Z7 III, is it a 60? Is it 100? Does it not exist at all? If I was to bet, I would say that Nikon would like to create a higher megapixel camera, that is slower, not slow, but slower than a Z8 and a Z9 and a Z6III, I'll create a poll around Z7III megapixels, and we'll put something like 45, 60, 80, 100. I'd love you to vote on which megapixels you would be interested in. Okay, time for us to talk about the Z9. What a camera. I have to say, as I said at the opening of this, my opinion about what a Z9II might be changed quite a lot when the A12 was announced. And the reason being is the Z9 is still a significant player in this market with the arrival of the R1, the R5II, and the A12. And the bottom line is, depending on your use case, if you're looking for the ultimate hybrid mirrorless all-rounder that can go into any environment, any environmental conditions, has the best battery life, has the unibody experience, and is built like a tank, and you want to be able to shoot 6K, 8K, you want to be able to shoot 45 megapixels, you want to be able to shoot fast, the Z9 ticks the majority of boxes. Yes, I know there's a couple of things the Z9 doesn't do that the A12 does. And yes, I know pre-release capture in RAW is one of them. And yes, I know some of you would absolutely love that. Sure. Can that happen in firmware? Well, maybe. Nikon have done so much to the Z9 in firmware since the start, so I wouldn't completely count it out. I just don't know. I hope so, because it will continue to make the Z9 the clear leader. But from my perspective and my use case, where I don't use pre-release capture, it's the clear leader for me and for many other users. And that's part of what informs me about what I think a Z9II will be. Here it is exactly 3 years later, literally 3 years later, almost to the day. And it is still a highly competitive camera. Now, if we're running on a 4-year cycle, it would be the end of 2025. And if we're running on a 5-year cycle, which Nikon have seemed to be happy to do, we've seen it with the Z52, we're probably seeing it with the Z5II. We're at 4.5 years and there's no indication or sign that it's coming. There is no Z7III, so it's going to be 5 years plus. Then maybe the Z9 sits in a 5-year timeline as well, which is perfectly fine. The previous 4-year timeline that we used to live by with the D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, roughly that, not every camera landed it in exactly the right moment, was kind of due to the Olympics and the idea of it being a flagship launch for that flagship moment. And I just kind of think we don't need to live in that world anymore. And thus, Z9 still very relevant, very powerful, and very affordable. The other thing we have to keep in mind about the Z9, it is the most affordable of the flagship cameras, coming in a full $1,000 below its competitors. And recently it has been $500 off, discounted quite significantly in the USA and other territories. It's a hell of a buy for what you get. And then when you add to that the lens ecosystem and everything that Nikon is doing when it comes to video and log and LUTs and red cinema cameras and everything else, it's a pretty exciting and bright future. The fact that the Z9 and the A12 and the A1 and the R1 or the R5II are all really not that different at this exact point in time, and yes, of course, not including pre-release capture in RAW, even so it still does pre-release capture in JPEG and it's very fast. It simply says to me that, well, Nikon have a little bit of time on their hands and that's fine, plus they've shown us firmware, so firmware could take us anywhere. How does that inform the Z9II? Well, we maybe have a bit more time on our hands. Where does a flagship go from here? Does Nikon go back to a sort of R1 style flagship, which is all about speed? Or does their flagship stay like the Z9, the ultimate hybrid cinema camera, stills camera, just gives you fantastic outcomes? Doesn't matter what your use case is. You can shoot long form 8K. It doesn't overheat because it's got that beautiful body, that large battery. You can shoot stills and you can keep up with the best of them. For majority of people's use cases, you've just got more than enough power. So the Z9II could be what we have today, plus more of it, more speed, more RAW, more frames per second. I don't think any more megapixels. I absolutely think 45 megapixels is where we're going to stay for flagship cameras because it's such a sweet spot of 8K video, which is more than pretty much everybody needs. It's a sweet spot for stills. It's a sweet spot for diffraction. It's absolutely a sweet spot for how fast a sensor can be read out. In other words, Nikon has created the first electronic-only shutter hybrid mirrorless camera, which the Z8 and the Z9 are, giving us features like, well, we don't have a shutter that will wear out, and B, we have a shutter shield that protects our sensor in harsh conditions. I think all of these things will stay the same. And the only thing that will change is it will get faster. Usually the flagship is where we see the release of new processors. So obviously, what comes after an X-Speed 7? Well, it'll be an X-Speed 8. So probably an X-Speed 8 in a Z9 II, and everything will be sped up. Frame rates, all that sort of stuff. And really the only discussion left is, what is that sensor? And I was thinking about this morning. The sensor we have is clearly very fast, and I still think it's the fastest on the market besides the A9 III in the hybrid mirrorless space. We know the R5II is not faster, and I think we know the A12 is still the same speed as the A1, which I think in this 45 to 50 megapixel category means that the Z9, Z8 is still the fastest sensor on the market. Now, the interesting thing to me is, having used these cameras extensively, I haven't seen signs of rolling shutter appear. So maybe we're kind of in a position where this sensor is about as fast as it needs to be, and then the only next step is global. Now that's crazy, because the idea of going global in the next year or two in a Z9, look, it's exciting, and if it's the flagship and the price remains the same as it is today, then that would be an astonishing outcome. But the A9 III, obviously we've been made aware of its limitations, with higher ISOs not being as great and the base ISO being at 250. That's that sensor. And it has its limitations. Can these limitations be overcome in the next couple of years? Well, Sony didn't do it with the A1 II, but that might not be because they couldn't do it. It simply might have been because they just didn't want to. They just didn't think it was necessary. There's no other competition in the market that's going to leapfrog them. So we'll just keep benefiting from the R&D we've done from the original sensor. Fine, that makes perfect sense. Does that mean Sony in another 2 or 3 years will have an A1 III global? Maybe. Let's also keep in mind that Nikon has some interesting patents which they keep tweaking. I think the most recent article around it being tweaked or added to was actually earlier this year. And this is a sensor that is capable of doing rolling shutter and global shutter. And by the look of it, it can do global shutter on certain parts of the sensor where global is required. I think that's how it works. That might also mean that the whole sensor can be global when you want it to be global, and the whole sensor can be rolling when you want it to be rolling. And what this would say to me is, if this technology is forthcoming, Nikon have got a sensor that does both things. It can be slower when you want more dynamic range, lower ISO and better high ISOs, and then it can go global when you need global. That would be amazing. A hybrid sensor in the best hybrid camera. Wow, if that's possible. The other interesting thing about Nikon today is they now own a company that has, well, maybe the best global sensor with great dynamic range. It shoots 8K as part of their Red cinema camera line. Now, yes, that camera is far more expensive, and yes, that's probably to do with that sensor. But they now have access to that technology, and they can now re-engineer it to suit the needs of a Z9 II and whatever else comes. Whichever way we look at it, they've got global patents, which are public and we can see, and they work both as a rolling and a global sensor. Fantastic. That would be great for a hybrid flagship. And they have access to fantastic global sensors. At this stage, I would put money either way, and it depends. What it depends on is how long away the Z9 II is. If it's coming soon, then I have a feeling we wouldn't go into that very exciting and interesting space. If it's longer, if it's further away, and as I said, because I just don't see the A9II as overly stiff competition for the majority of Z9 users, and who knows what will happen with firmware, maybe Nikon have a little bit more time on their hands to refine what a Z9II might be. Maybe global, or maybe a hybrid sensor. And of course, well, maybe there's a sensor somewhere in between the very, very fast sensor we have today and global. Maybe with technological advances, they can just make it that little bit faster again. It's not global, but it has even better rolling shutter performance. Not that I've ever really seen anything unless I try one of those unrealistic tests with a 400mm lens and then I swing it like this with a pole that's, 7 meters away. Of course, you can generate rolling shutter in a non-realistic use case. Great work. Great work for those people that achieved that. Well done. I'm very proud of you. So it's about timing. Now, what would I want? Well, I think what I would want personally is to wait longer because my Z9 is amazing. It still does and gives me everything that I want. So personally, I would be happy to wait longer for more tech. A bigger leap, like the big leap we saw from, say, a Z7II to a Z9, rather than it being sooner and being more iterative, like Sony have done with the A9II. Because the Z9 is still so fabulous, and if with firmware we can just get a few tiny little things that people are after, well, wow, we're living the dream. We're living on a prayer. We're halfway there. I mean, I already think we're living the dream, and yeah, that's me, because the Z9 and the Z8, let's not forget that the Z8 is basically the Z9 just with slightly different heat performance. Otherwise, pretty much everything is the same from a technology perspective. Clearly not from an ergonomic perspective. We really are in super duper great shape when we think about the Nikon range. All right, everybody. Well, what would you prefer? Would you prefer a Z9II sooner with less tech and it being more like an A9II upgrade? Or would you prefer it to be longer and have more tech? More of a leap, more exciting. And thus, if it is that, just a faster rolling shutter that's even more ridiculously fast, but still gives us great performance like we have today, or global? Do you want to see global? Who knows? It just simply might not be ready at the price point. Even so, Red are doing it right now with their Raptor. They might be wildly expensive sensors that just can't be that the price just simply can't be brought down enough yet. Who knows? Just got to get these flowers the right color. Done. I would love to know your thoughts and speculations along with your desires in the comments below. It's been so good to see you, and if this is your first time here, I would love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right, bye for now.